All right. Well, welcome everybody. If I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you before, and I do see a ton of familiar faces, which is always great. Quick introduction. My name is Jonathan Feinstein. I live here in Dallas, Texas. I've been here for about the last 16, 17 years. I currently serve as the Texas State Director with a fantastic organization. Of course, I'm biased, called the Education Trust, or EdTrust for short. I know you're not here to hear about EdTrust, so I'll get through the introduction quickly. But as it says on the screen, we are fierce advocates for education equity, and the way we do our work is centered around data. It is student focused. It is, as I said, equity driven. We really do research and advocacy work. The way that we try and do that when we're doing it at what I like to call a 10 of 10 is kind of bridging these separate worlds that can feel often separate, right, in terms of policy and community. And this call is a great example of how we try and do that by sharing information, resources, research tools to help anybody and everybody who wants to play a part in the decisions that impact our students, our communities, to find ways to do that. So hopefully you leave here feeling like you learned a little bit more, and some of that divide has been bridged. You probably got, well, you're here because you know what to expect. The agenda is pretty straightforward. We're just going to try and get everybody up to speed. We can't get into all the play-by-play and all the details through what was a very long 2023 legislative session, including a record 4 special sessions that lasted really from January 1 up until December 6th. So really the entirety of the year. But want to provide some context of what we were, what was going on, if we can get our minds around what we knew, especially around the budget as we got into the legislative session and into this next biennium, right? Because we do our legislative sessions and our budgets on a 2-year cycle here in Texas. We'll briefly touch on a couple of really big, important bills that did, in fact, pass during the regular session, especially in the pre-K through 12 space. There was lots going on in higher education as well, but we won't focus as much on that. And I think that really the bulk of the conversation will be what happened during that fourth and critical special session. What were some of the proposals that were at play? We'll get into some of those details. I imagine those details will reemerge as we look ahead to what may come next, and we'll try and just have a conversation about what at least we're paying attention to, maybe what you can be watching, and not just watching, but as advocates participating in really in the coming months. So that's kind of the rough agenda. We're going to dive right in. As I said, kind of budget context, where were we coming into this legislative session, especially when it came to public education? The first thing that, I feel like maybe has been buried, but that is going to be quickly reemerging in the news or in the headlines or in public consciousness is the fact that, when the pandemic started, the federal government really made a rather unprecedented and very significant investment in our public education system. So going back to 2020, Texas schools received upwards of $19 billion in federal ESSER funds. We'll come back to ESSER, but that stands for Elementary and Secondary Emergency Relief Funds. And the reason why I bring that up now is, one, that is a very, very large sum of money. When you think about the context of, say, House Bill 3, which was landmark school finance reform that passed back in 2019, the amount of additional dollars that kind of were appropriated to schools was about $6.5 billion. So we're talking about 3 times that amount. Of course, the difference is these are one-time funds. They're not coming back. In fact, as it says on the screen, they're expiring. We're in the last school year where school districts can really budget and spend that significant amount of money. So those dollars are set to expire September 30th. And we'll come back to this in terms of what comes next. But I mention that because, school districts have used those funds for a wide range of different expenses. And now, as those funds are set to expire, it really is incumbent and important to be looking at, so what is our state doing, not doing, as districts face kind of what is being called the fiscal cliff of those funds. Second piece here, which I'm sure a lot of you may have heard about, but just as a reminder, the state revenue position was really, really positive and strong. There was a lot of money to work with. Of course, it isn't just about public education, lots of other priorities for the state, but that was close to $33 billion. Some might have called that a budget surplus. Really, it's a fund balance. There was additional dollars, right, beyond what they had spent in the previous year. And there are spending caps that are constitutionally required. But just for context, money was not really an object in terms of going into this session. One of the things, as a lot of you know, that the legislature has to do, they are required to do, is they have to pass a budget. And they did pass a budget bill, and I want to just cover a few things here. First of all, they did appropriate all of the public school funding that they were required to under current law. So I mentioned House Bill 3 back in 2019. There were updates or cleanups to that broad school finance bill in the previous session. That was House Bill 1525. All of that funding was appropriated under that current law. Another big use of that record fund balance was property tax relief. So about half of that fund balance was directly kind of given to taxpayers in the form of tax relief. We'll talk about some of the nuances and policy vehicles for this. There was additional dollars flowed through schools into school safety. Talk about House Bill 3. This is a different House Bill 3. This was the new House Bill 3. We'll touch on that in just a second, because that was one of the big public education bills that did pass. And then I think the last two bullets here are just really important for context. The budget passed with an appropriation of an additional $4.5 billion for public education. But that appropriation in the budget was contingent on actually passing legislation that would tell us how that $4.5 billion would in fact be meant to be spent. And then, of course, school choice, vouchers, education savings accounts. There are lots of terms that you'll hear, but that was appropriated in the budget at about $500 million, so $500 million. And similarly, contingent on a bill actually passing to appropriate those funds. The last piece here that you can see, and I mentioned kind of, we're not going to get into all the details. Maybe there are other experts who can answer towards the end about this. But on top of that $4.5 billion, at the end of the day, when you looked at some of those spending limits that are in place, and you looked at kind of what was left over, there was roughly another $6 billion that were still on the table when we were going into that fourth special session, and that could have gone above and beyond that $4.5 billion that was already in the budget. Of course, there could have been even more than that left over, but that would have required some majority votes in either of the chambers. So that's where we entered. A lot happened after we entered. I'm not going to get into all of it, but you probably caught a lot of the headlines. There was an impeachment trial of the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, that really dominated the end of the very end of the regular session. It also fueled a lot of animosity between the two chambers, between the House and the Senate. A lot of that public animosity, not just on the impeachment, but a number of issues, including the property tax debate that followed between the Lieutenant Governor, the leader of the Senate, and the Speaker in the House, Dave Phelan. So that was another factor that kind of grew and continued on through the year. And then I think the other just context piece of this, you kind of knew going in that there were strong forces at work that were pro-voucher, pro-ESA. And I've seen some estimates that, the lobbying expense and presence amongst those voices in the Capitol were pretty expensive. So estimates of roughly $2 to $3 million that were spent in the building support and advocating for education savings accounts. So we'll come back to some of that, but I just wanted to lay that context. The other piece, and I do want to give a quick shout out and credit former Representative Dan Huberty, who's now with Moat Casey. He gave his debrief on another call, and I wanted to borrow from him because I think this gives some historical context about going into this session, especially as it related to this issue of vouchers, education savings accounts. So there's something called it's called the Herrero Amendment because now retiring House member Abel Herrero has brought this amendment as part of the budget debates in several previous sessions. And it's called a test vote. You may see it referred to that. This is not an amendment that actually made it into the final budget, but it really is. This was an early test. So while they're having their budget debates, and you can see the language on the screen, but it's basically a test vote to see what's the level of support among House members for, any bill that would include vouchers or a similar program. And this gives you some historical context to see how those votes have landed, really dating back over the last 5 sessions. I don't have to tell you, you can look at the trend that when this test vote happened during the regular session, there was more more support for vouchers or ESAs than there historically has been. Not a majority, right? But still, you can kind of see the trend going from recent history. So you kind of knew that there was some softening, there was some movement, at least on the House side, in terms of the willingness to entertain legislation that might include ESAs or a voucher. That being said, and we're going to get back to that, but I do want to say there were bills that did pass that I think provide, and these are ones that specifically had a fiscal note, but there are other important pieces of legislation that are not covered here, to be clear, and happy to share more information about those. I mentioned the increased investment tied to school safety, and House Bill 3 was that vehicle. You've probably heard some or seen some of the headlines around this. Very heavy focus on school hardening, on emergency preparedness, and a lot of attention, especially on mandating the presence of armed security officers on every campus. That, of course, comes with a cost. You can see what changes to what was a school safety allotment introduced in 2019. That per pupil kind of increased to $10 per student was very marginal. I think it was $9 and something before, as well as this new flat campus-based kind of increase. There was a good cause exemption that I believe a number of districts, including some of our North Texas districts, have requested that they could claim due to availability of funding or qualified personnel. We're again mostly talking about armed security personnel. And there has been a lot of focus, and I think an acknowledged focus, even amongst state legislators, that the original appropriation was not enough. I've heard some estimate that the underfunded aspect of these mandates could be as high as about $1 billion statewide. The second piece, which some of you may also be hearing about, House Bill 1605, was focused on additional resources and processes for ensuring school districts have access, and teachers as well as students have access to high quality instructional materials. So you can see some details here in there. A lot of this is still in motion. So to be clear, this money is on the table, but a lot of it is not moving yet because there is a ton of regulatory work that's happening at the TEA, as well as with the State Board of Education, establishing a new process for approving materials. They're starting, by the way, with K-8 English language arts and Spanish language arts, as well as K-12 math. And there's going to be a new process for reviewing materials and making those materials available for discretionary adoption at the local level. So again, if you're interested in that, there are lots of experts on the call, I know, who are involved in that work. So just another opportunity to stay involved, because a lot of those decisions are continuing to happen, but all on track to starting to see some of those materials become available and adopted in classrooms, but not this year and not next school year, but in the 25-26 school year. So again, this did have a fiscal note attached to it, but a lot of that, again, is contingent on other things happening and rules and processes. So again, we could talk about House Bill 8, a big investment in our community college system, about $680 million going into of additional funding going into our community colleges. Some of that's relevant to K-12 because it does, there are some dual credit and dual enrollment dollars that ultimately are going to benefit students in our high schools. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that for now. I also want to call attention to components of a bill of legislation that we'll come back to, but that just had broad bipartisan support in both chambers around teacher workforce. So it's, as you may also recall, in the interim, so prior to session, Governor Abbott formed a teacher vacancy task force, focusing attention and delivering the insights of a lot of educators and district leaders across the state. I know I see our friends at Teach Plus who were instrumental in helping to bring teacher voice into that conversation. And a lot of the recommendations that came from that task force made their way into bills that were in both chambers. And I just wanted to call attention to a few of these in detail because this was really strong policy that had a lot of thought and evidence behind it. This would have introduced a teacher residency partnership program that included a pretty big fiscal note and allotment that would not just create really these year-long kind of residency experiences, but for educators before becoming teachers of record. They also would have been paid, which is really, really important in terms of expanding access and affordability to folks who want to go into high quality teacher preparation pathways. It also just would have created a lot more encouraged and incentivized even stronger partnership between employers, in this case, school districts, and those preparation programs. It also would have expanded elements that were introduced in House Bill 3 back in 2019, like the teacher incentive allotment and the mentor program allotment, right? Both of which are designed to make sure, one, there's more additional support for early career teachers, but number two, that those early career teachers can more quickly be compensated for their effectiveness. And we've seen the impact of that here in North Texas, in Dallas, but increasingly across the state. So it would have invested more in compensation through that vehicle, as well as a number of other benefits that came forward in that task force, like pre-K eligibility for the children of classroom teachers, entirely waiving the certification exam fees, again, knocking down one more barrier for folks who want to do this really incredibly challenging and demanding work of becoming teachers, as well as building on one of the recommendations around teacher time study and just making sure that the workload and the working conditions of teachers improve in the state. So I wanted to just note that, and just to give you some vote counts, House Bill 11 passed on the House side with 145-3 supporting it. On the Senate side, SB 9 passed 22-9. So these were both bills that passed, but that were caught up in really what followed, which was a stalemate that ensued around what are we going to do to basically pass school finance legislation. And to be clear, and y'all probably saw a lot of this in the headlines, so there was nothing passed in the regular session really bigger than the bills I mentioned, despite several attempts. In the third, we got through property tax, negotiations in the first and the second special sessions. And then the third special session was, there were other items, but just to read off, most of the debate in the third special session was a back and forth about what actually could be taken up under the previous call. So for those who maybe don't know, it is the governor who has to initiate a special session. He alone has the authority to call legislators back. And part of what he has to do is issue basically the parameters, what kind of legislation can be taken up. And the third special session, the language in that call was providing education savings accounts for all Texas school children. That was it. So there was a lot of, kind of negotiation back and forth, especially between House leadership, the Speaker's office, and the governor to widen the call, right? To say, we don't think it's appropriate, and we don't think that there's the will for the House to take up, an ESA bill without at least entertaining and taking up a bill around public school funding to appropriate, again, the money I mentioned earlier. So after that kind of stalemate, in fact, Governor Abbott does widen the call. The text you can see on the screen is what was in the call, and it was much more expansive, right? So it included basically anything related to primary and secondary education, teacher compensation, public school finance, right? So the door was then widened for some things to move forward and to see if there actually could be some legislation that could come forward and could move. So at that point, I do want to just kind of get into, how did that then play out? And what did some of these bills actually look like that moved forward? So on the Senate side, and to be clear, I mentioned the Herrero Amendment, and kind of the House has always historically been kind of the bulwark of opposition against anything resembling a voucher or an ESA program. Not so much in the Senate. So the Senate, even during the regular session, passed an education savings account bill. They made tweaks to it along the way. The version that they passed in the fourth special session, and you can see what the vote looked like. You'd have to check me on this to make sure it's not quite a full vote, but I'm relatively positive it was a party line vote with all Republicans voting for and Democrats voting against. And it was actually a pretty, there are lots of, these were long bills, but the high level, for those who are interested in that, education savings account would have established a flat $8,000 basically amount that would have been available to all students in the state. So again, you heard a lot, or you'll continue to hear a lot about universal access or universal eligibility, and that was really the sticking point for the governor. The governor wanted, that was kind of his line in the sand and non-negotiable, that there are a lot of things that an ESA program could look like, but he really wanted to be able to say, even if there were caveats to how much money was appropriated or initially how many students would be able to participate, that it would be eligible for all Texas school children, like that call that I mentioned, his language in the third special session. So this would have done that. And you can see the amount. Other elements of it would basically have created a lottery system, and it would have capped the students who would have been able to receive that ESA based largely on income bands. And then there was an addition here of a $1,000 amount for basically homeschooled students. So that was a separate bill, Senate Bill 1. Senate Bill 2 was kind of the public school finance bill. So these were separate bills, and you can see the level of supports of that one passed 27-1. And it wasn't quite as robust or kind of nuanced as a lot of the legislation we'll get to on the House side, which was much bigger and included a lot of other components. But the highlights in this bill were basically a one-time teacher retention bonus that was not insignificant in terms of the amount of money that was being discussed. So it would have given an additional $10,000 per year to teachers in small school districts, and it would have given $3,000 in additional salary for teachers in larger school districts, so districts with more than 5,000 students. It would have basically established this retention allotment in an ongoing way. So it would have maintained a sizable additional investment in public schools, and specifically in teacher pay. It would have similarly, like I mentioned earlier, expanded the teacher incentive allotment in a lot of the same ways that were kind of discussed in previous legislation that I just spoke to. And it would have made a modest increase in the basic allotment. Without getting into the details of public school finance in Texas, the basic allotment is basically the entitlement that is tied to every student in the state. And there are weights that get applied to that basic allotment, but it's the foundation in which we say every student in the state of Texas is at minimum guaranteed this amount. And it currently sits at about $6,100. Again, that's not the total amount, but that's that component of the system. And that basic allotment hasn't moved since House Bill 3 passed in 2019. And then the last piece of this, I mentioned kind of the unfunded aspect of the school safety bill that passed this session. So in terms of even the Senate recognizing that there was more work to do there, this version would have doubled those allotments that were previously passed in the regular session. So they did their business. They actually did that very quickly without a ton of debate. All eyes really were on the House. And if the slide will cooperate. So what happened in the House? So the big bill in the fourth special session, really the only bill, I shouldn't say the only bill, there were other school safety bills and so forth, but House Bill 1 was really the big one that all eyes were on. And I mentioned the fiscal note that the Senate had put forward on the previous slide, right? What did it say? 5.2. So the House goes even higher with the fiscal note of $7.5 billion, which I mentioned that because a lot of the question was, is there a deal on the table? Is there any scenario in which you could put together enough additional funding for public schools, as well as some other pieces related to assessment, accountability that I'll talk about in a second, that could get enough votes in the House to even consider, right, passing a bill that would include some form of ESAs or vouchers. So this was a massive bill. It was 177 pages. It included a lot of the bills that never got across the finish line during the regular session. Just to touch on a few of those pieces, I mentioned House Bill 11 and all those teacher vacancy task force recommendations. So it basically included all of that, as well as some of those retention stipends for all teachers, including part-time employees. It would have significantly increased that basic allotment. I mentioned it was at 61. There you go, up to 6,700. It would have created new allotments, including for fine arts, advanced math pathways. It would have increased or adjusted a lot of allotments. For example, I know we have a lot of early childhood advocates probably on the call. This would have increased that kind of early childhood allotment that was established back in 2019. It would have made it dramatic changes to the way that we fund special education in the state. By the way, there was an interim commission on special education funding, so none of those recommendations have yet made it into law. Some of you are probably continuing to follow news about the ongoing debate and between the federal government and the state in terms of our compliance and adequacy in terms of supporting special education in the state. So it would have done a lot on the school finance side. There were early literacy components to this. That this was part of a separate bill that moved during the regular session that I think had broad support, but would have strengthened a lot of the data and intervention prior to third grade to make sure that we're not just in the constant churn of intervention and trying to catch students up, which we historically have not done a very good job systemically in doing once students get behind. Education savings account. So of course it was going to be in there. It was packaged together. The chair of the House Public Education Committee, Chair Buckley, was committed to kind of putting these things together to see if he could make this, in his words, kind of a both and. And in the education savings accounts, you can see some of the differences between what was being proposed in the House versus the Senate. So this, in the House version, rather than that flat or predetermined kind of per student amount, it actually would have been tied to the state's investment in public school funding. So it would have equaled 75% of the estimated statewide average of local and state funding per student, which actually would have been more. I think based on current funding levels, it would have been closer to $10,000 per student. Rather than this lottery system, it actually would have prioritized access first for children with disabilities and children experiencing poverty at varying levels. So in other words, last in line would have been families and students who probably can already afford a private school education or some other use of these dollars. Also, a key difference and a sticking point for the House is it would have required students who participated in the ESA to be administered annual assessment, again, either a STAR or a nationally norm referenced assessment. And then I think, a lot of the attention, while appropriated at $500 million for the next 2 years, it was important to look at the analysis of under this structure, and it's always based on models, and it's really hard to know exactly how families and students and schools would respond. But there was some projection about, okay, if we establish this, what's the ongoing cost to the state, right? And so those projections, and I'm not an expert, so I can't even opine about the accuracy about these, projected the growth of the program through 2028 and projected that the cost would have gone up to about $2.3 billion by then. So I mentioned that because, again, the conversation has always been, if you introduce basically this new system, right, and it would be a new system that the state is basically required to fund, or at least kind of take into consideration in terms of its budgets in the future. It's important to be thinking not just in the short term, but in the long term. The last piece, which again, I don't think a lot of attention, but this was worked into House Bill 1 because I think there were some members, at least, and I'm talking here mostly in courting certain rural Republicans to maybe consider this, was eliminating the current public school assessment and accountability system. So basically, effectively eliminating or sunsetting 8 through F and predetermining when that would happen in August of 2026, requiring the use of the previous 8 through F system until then. By the way, the current 8 through F system has no DNF ratings, and there's a lot of litigation and court cases, which we won't get into the details of, but this would have basically preempted or kind of determined the outcome before that court case may be fully played out, and then would have established a commission on assessment and accountability to kind of determine on a very short timeline what would replace the current system. So all of these pieces are kind of cobbled together into House Bill 1. It passes out of committee. By the way, passes out of committee on a party line vote, and ultimately reaches the floor November 17th. By the way, this is the first time that any bill, even including the voucher or ESA, had made it this far in terms of reaching the House floor since 2005. So it's a huge day. All eyes are on the House. And there was every expectation that what would happen did happen, which is that the very first amendment that would be brought forward would basically to take this massive bill and to strip out that part of the bill that had the education savings account. So basically, we're going back to the Herrero Amendment, right? Which is, what's the level of support amongst the House, and in particular, House Republicans, because there isn't a single House Democrat who voted for ESAs. And you basically get the same vote that you got on the Herrero Amendment. There are a couple of flips. You can see a couple of the members who actually changed their votes between the regular session way back whenever. I don't know when the Herrero Amendment is. I'm going to guess it was probably in March or April, to here we are, November 17th. So ESAs get stripped out of the bill. There is no vote on the rest of the bill. The chair and the bill author, Chair Buckley, withdraws the bill, returns it to committee. There's still some time on the clock after the Thanksgiving holiday, but effectively that ends the special session. So that's kind of, and I encourage everybody, and Texas Tribune does a great job, has a good tracker. This is a screenshot, but you can see and search for, how did each individual House member vote on that amendment. So again, to be clear, a yay vote, a yes vote, basically was a no to ESA votes. It's a little confusing in terms of just figuring that part out. Again, I'm winding down, and I do want to leave time for, I'm sure, a lot of questions. So I'm gonna wrap up hopefully in the next few minutes. What comes next? So immediately after the fourth special session, and Governor Abbott had kind of telegraphed this even before, the third, or maybe the fourth, and maybe even the third. But the statement that was released was that he wants to continue to, quote, work with Texas legislators and at the ballot box to get school choice for all Texas families. So all eyes turn to the filing deadline for state legislative seats, which was December 11th. So almost immediately after the fourth special session ends, we see a lot of challengers in open seats, but also to incumbent seats for those House Republicans who voted against the ESAs. Governor Abbott comes out, endorses those challengers. And sure, if you haven't seen, a lot of headlines around just the influx of campaign money that's coming from pro-voucher or pro-ESA sources. One of those is called the American Federation for Children. So their PAC is called the Victory Fund. So if you want to kind of track like who's running, where's their money coming from, who's endorsing or supporting them. Of course, you also have Attorney General Paxton, who's getting behind challengers because he's on his vengeance tour in terms of House members who voted to impeach him. So there are a lot of kind of directions that are moving in the political sphere, and quite honestly, it's hard to keep track of all that. If you don't want to track it beforehand, just wait until March 5th. March 5th is when those primary elections are going to be happening across the state, and that's really going to determine and give us a strong sense of, has the math changed at all in the House? Because it's hard to imagine that the future is going to look dramatically different than the past if there aren't some changes in those seats, especially amongst those 21 House rural Republicans who've historically been, again, that firewall against vouchers or ESAs. And I put a couple of friendly reminders in there for you and your friends in terms of registering to vote and when early voting is going to be starting for those primaries. There's this big open question. Could there be a fifth special session? In theory, yes. Again, I'm not going to try to be the crystal ball here, but I would have to imagine if there is something that's going to happen, it would happen after those primaries, especially if there is a decisive vote. And it's clear that maybe ESAs just don't have a political future in the 89th session, but that's not me probably opining even too much at that point. I think it's very uncertain, very unclear. I will say highly unlikely at this point. In terms of what we do know will happen, life goes on. The members who are there are going to continue doing the work that they're required to do. So House and Senate leaders will be releasing what's known as interim charges. So in this year, prior to the next session, they're gonna listen to their constituents. They're gonna listen to each other about what are the priorities they want to study. I think a lot of the same things that didn't get resolved during the regular session or during the special session will again be discussed and debated in hearings. We don't yet know when those charges will get released or exactly when those hearings will be scheduled. Likely sometime in late spring or through the summer. That's historically when they've happened. So you can also continue to check in there. I know a lot of you are probably more concerned with, well, like, okay, they're doing the politics thing. What's happening in local school districts, and what does that potentially mean for students, for educators, and for the communities I care about? So I mentioned, if you're not plugged in, school districts, school boards are starting in this calendar year, beginning of this calendar year, to talk about budget. They're looking ahead to the next school year, and they're looking at what are the available funds from those federal dollars. What are the kinds of programs that maybe we were leaning heavily on those federal funds for in hopes that additional state dollars would help us, kind of come down gradually or sustain where they saw that it was good investments. Of course, they're continuing to face persistent inflation. And again, there's no additional funding in sight from the state. Some of you may have seen this, kind of bad news, especially for some districts who there was, I think, some back and forth between our state Health and Human Services and the federal government around some dollars that were being used through Medicaid reimbursements. I don't know the details. We might have others on the call who are experts on this, but specific districts took a hit in terms of some dollars they're going to have to make up locally as a result of that. And again, it's hard to tell. Every school district may be in very different just fiscal positions. And that's where it's really important for all of us, depending on the school districts that we live in, to get more engaged, informed, because I do think there are going to be tough choices. Those choices can look different. Some districts, especially larger ones, probably have some sizable reserves, right? Some fund balances that they can lean on into the next fiscal year and do as much to kind of curtail the pain or to prevent broad cuts or even school closures. Others are probably going to have to make some of those cuts. Maybe other districts will actually go to their local voters for additional local revenue. I mean, those of you who don't know me, I've been involved in some of those here in Dallas prior to House Bill 3, and they tend to have a lot of local support. Local communities want to support their public schools. And so those will be things to look for in the future. And just a couple of resources on that note, if you want to learn more, I'll try and get these links into the chat. The Edgenomics Lab at Georgetown has done a good job of giving visibility into how much money did my school district receive in those federal ESSER dollars and how much have they spent down. Unfortunately, that hasn't been updated in a while, but it may give you at least a checkpoint, and we'll definitely keep an eye on local updates there. EdTrust, just plugging some resources that we've made available to local advocates in terms of the kinds of questions that you can be asking about to your school leaders and to your administrative leaders in terms of how to make really smart, equity-driven choices as those ESSER funds wind down. Lastly, I know we covered a lot there, and it's always tough to get to everything. So if you don't already have this is my contact information, phone, email, as well as EdTrust Texas on X, formerly known as Twitter, and Instagram, if you're just interested in what we're up to. But we're here, like I said at the top, to be that bridge between policymakers and the community and help create on-ramps for anybody who wants to be involved in those decisions. So I am going to stop recording